You may not... You may not want to give me this applause when I finish. Ladies and gentlemen, shame upon you for not watching the debate. I watched the first 20 minutes, and you may be right to be here. Oof, even World War II came up. I'm not going to try and persuade you to buy my new book. If you read the previous one, which is 1,300 pages, do not buy this one, but it's only 500. But I thought I should explain why I call it The Age of the Warrior. It is indeed a book of various articles which I've put together by themes. Cinema, cliches in journalism, the mass grave of the Titanic, Iraq, death, all my pet obsessions, in fact. But one of them, of course, is Iraq, because I've been going there since 1978. I was in the Iran-Iraq War, and I covered the 91 Gulf War, and of course the 2003 Gulf War. So I thought I'd read you just part of the article, which is actually called The Age of the Warrior, which is the article which gave my book its name. In the week that George Bush took to fantasizing that his blood-soaked war on terror would lead the 21st century into a shining age of human liberty, I've forgotten that quote, I went through my mailbag to find a frightening letter addressed to me by an American veteran from Vietnam, whose son is serving as a lieutenant colonel and medical doctor with US forces in Baghdad. Put simply, my American friend believes the change of military creed under the Bush administration, from that of soldier to that of warrior, is encouraging American troops to commit atrocities. From Abu Ghraib to Guantanamo to Bagram, to the battlefields of Iraq and to the black prisons of the CIA, humiliation and beatings, rape, anal rape, murder have now become so commonplace that each new outrage is creeping into the inside pages of our newspapers. My reporting notebooks are full of Afghan and Iraqi complaints of torture and beatings from August 2002 and then from 2003 to the present. How, I keep asking myself, did this happen? Obviously the trail leads to the top, but where did this cult of cruelty begin? So first, here's the official US Army's Soldier's Creed, originally drawn up to prevent any more Vietnam atrocities. After My Lai, every soldier carried this document with him. I am an American soldier. I am a member of the United States Army, a protector of the greatest nation on earth. Because I'm proud of the uniform I wear, I will always act in ways creditable to the military service and the nation that it is sworn to guard. No matter what situation I'm in, I will never do anything for pleasure, profit, or personal safety which will disgrace my uniform, my unit, or my country. I will use every means I have, even beyond the line of duty, to restrain my army comrades from actions disgraceful to themselves and the uniform. I am proud of my country and its flag. I will try to make the people of this nation proud of the service I represent, for I am an American soldier. I think it's pretty good. It's pretty eloquent. Donald Rumsfeld changed it, and here's the new version of what is now called the warrior ethos. I am an American soldier. I am a warrior and a member of a team. I serve the people of the United States and live the Army values. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. I am disciplined, physically and mentally tough, trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and drills. I always maintain my arms, my equipment, and myself. I am an expert and I am a professional. I stand ready to deploy, engage, and destroy the enemies of the United States of America in close combat. I am a guardian of freedom and the American way of life. I am an American soldier. Like most Europeans and an awful lot of Americans, I was quite unaware of this new and ferocious code for US Armed Forces. Although it's not hard to see how it fits in with Bush's rantings. I'm tempted to point this out in detail, but my American veteran did so with such eloquence in his letter to me that the response should come in his words. The warrior creed, he wrote to me, allows no end to any conflict except total destruction of the enemy. It allows no defeat and does not allow one ever to stop fighting, lending itself to the idea of the long war. It says nothing about following orders. It says nothing about obeying laws or showing restraint. It says nothing about dishonorable actions. I've come to believe that those words led us to Abu Ghraib and Bagram and the secret torture rooms in Europe and elsewhere, and to Guantanamo. I want to talk a little bit this evening about the use of words, or rather the lack of the use of words, because I think our reporting of the Middle East, particularly of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but elsewhere too, is lethal. If you start on the most basic use of semantics, look at our coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Ever since Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, told US diplomats in the Middle East that they should no longer refer to the occupied territories, they should call them disputed. Many American papers use the word disputed, not occupied. The wall is frequently referred to as a security barrier, which is the East German expression for the Berlin Wall, Sicherheit, they called it the security barrier, or the fence. A colony for Israelis, and Israelis only, on Arab land is referred to as a settlement, or a neighborhood, or most recently, an outpost. Now, for me, there's a problem with all this. First of all is the gutlessness of journalists for not calling a spade, fearful, no doubt, of criticism, sometimes from the Arabs, more often from Israel. But on top of this, you see, and I'm against all violence for any reason ever, if you see a picture or a film or a video of a Palestinian throwing a stone, if you know that his land is occupied, that a wall has been built over his family's land, that settlements are being built on Arab land for which Arabs have entitlement deeds, you might understand the context in which he throws the stone. But if it's about a dispute, something you can solve over a cup of tea or in a law court, if it's about a fence, something that might run at the bottom of a garden, then clearly anyone who throws a stone over that is generically violent. The Palestinians become generically violent people in this discourse, this semantic world, which we present. I think that we have been very cowardly in our reporting of the Middle East. We've been very cowardly in our reporting, by and large, of the whole Middle East area and Southwest Asia, of Afghanistan. Our endless belief that we're going to actually have success in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now I suppose Pakistan as well. I simply fail to understand how even on television we will not show you the reality. You know, if you saw on the evening news when we are at war in the Middle East, what I see on the battlefield and in the hospitals, you would never ever believe in the justification of war. I'll give you a small example of what I'm talking about. In April 2003, I was in Baghdad. I was with the Iraqis throughout the invasion and traveling a bit inside Iraq under air attack. And an Al Jazeera crew arrived from Basra up the long road. I'd got halfway down. It was just, I was so frightened I couldn't ride anymore. You know, it's just so many airplanes. And they got the whole way up from Basra to Baghdad with tape, which they'd taken in Basra of the victims of British artillery fire. The British fired artillery into Basra. They didn't want to go in on foot because they'd lose too many men. So the idea was to batter away at Saddam's forces until they surrendered. And of course, as usual, the civilians were the principal victims. Soldiers too, but mostly civilians. And on the videotape, there were the most appalling scenes of dead children, dead soldiers, of course, but dead women, and terrible wounds. A woman with her intestines hanging out, a child with an eye missing, screaming and shrieking in pain. And when they arrived in Baghdad, there's a syndication system that rolls in every time a war starts, whereas Al Jazeera's tape goes to CNN and it goes to Reuters, and Reuters' film goes to Al Jazeera and so on. And I knew the crew, there were 2 Lebanese and 1 Syrian, and they were feeding their tape of the Basra horrors to London, to Reuters. And after about a minute, I heard this voice come down the satellite from London. You know, there's not much point in showing any more of this. You know, people are going to be having tea and dinner tonight. They can't watch this. And the poor old crew said, you know, but please, we've been in great danger today. We've got this film. Just watch a bit more. This is what is happening. By which time my notebook had come out, because this was going to be my report for the next day's copy of The Independent. And then they went on showing this appalling film, and a voice came down there. This, you know, this is the obscenity of war. This is pornography. We can't show this. And they said, but please, just watch a little bit more. This is the reality of what we've just seen, you know. And the film went on, and blood was all over the floor of this hospital ward, you know. And then the voice came back. This time my pen was skidding over the page and said, you know, we can't show this because we've got to respect the dead. We didn't respect them when they were alive. We didn't respect them when they blew them to pieces. But when they're dead, by God, we respect them so much, you know. And so by not, of course you didn't see these pictures. Of course you didn't. If an Iraqi was obliging enough to sort of die romantically, but not blown into bits beside the road, you might see a distant shot. You know, the price of war, an Iraqi lies dead by the road to wherever. But by and large, we've presented you, as we always do on television, with war as a bloodless sandpit. War, not as I see it, and you would if you go there, and there must be people here who were probably in Vietnam. I'm not the only person in this room to have seen war, I'm sure. But, you know, war is primarily not about victory or defeat. It is primarily about death. And it represents, I think, the total failure of the human spirit. But this is largely kept from you. It is an enormous irony that you'll see more of what we see in real war in feature films like Saving Private Ryan than you will on television, which is meant to be showing you the reality of war, which pretends that it is. That the war you see on television is basically a bloodless sandpit. And thus it allows people like President Bush, and indeed my own dear former late Prime Minister, Tony Blair, to use war as a policy option, something we might have to do to bring about what we want, not as something which is in the national interest of our people to carry out for our own protection. We can lie to you about that. You know, I'm amazed, for example, that the New York Times had the whole Judith Miller saga of weapons of mass destruction based upon the language and words and information of Ahmed Shalabi, of all people. Then after the war, this massive, huge, boring, tedious mea culpa about how we should have asked more questions and we should have done this, etc., which the New York Times published. And then bingo, when I open the New York Times now, it's all about the weapons of mass destruction in Syria and the weapons of mass destruction in Iran, and on we go again. I think one of the great problems, it exists in Europe and it exists in Britain, but more so here, is this osmotic, parasitic relationship between journalists and power. You only have to see this if, I'm not recommending you to watch presidential press conferences, but if you turn on CNN, again, I don't recommend that, but if you do, and you see the reporters saying, Mr. President, Mr. President, and then the president says, yes, John, yes, Bob, yes, Mary. See, this is the way the relationship works. And I can understand that, when your country goes to war, to challenge authority looks unpatriotic and thus potentially subversive. And there are all kinds of ghosts from the 40s and 50s which hover around us all. But, I think, well, I'll best describe a conversation I had a couple of years ago with my friend Amira Haas, who's a very fine Israeli journalist working for Haaretz. If you don't read her, you should. And we were in Jerusalem discussing what was the job of a foreign correspondent. And being a Brit, of course, I was going on about how, our job is to be the first witnesses to history, blah, 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 blah. And she said, no, Robert, you're wrong. Our job is to monitor the centers of power, to challenge authority, especially when they go to war, and especially when they use lies to do it. And that is the best description I've heard of what a foreign correspondent's job is, or should be, ever. But we don't generally do that. Over and over again, when I watch the State Department correspondent, the White House correspondent, the Defense Department correspondent, or the lobby correspondents in London, they have become mouthpieces for power. They have, in effect, become the spokesman. I'll give you an example of this. When I was doing the book tour for my previous book, The Great War for Civilization, I was in LA, as I just was actually a couple of days ago. And I opened my morning Los Angeles Times, there it is, and there was a story on the front page. This is about sourcing, right? In a battle of wits, Iraq's insurgency mastermind steps ahead of the United States. This was the time of Zarqawi, before he was killed in the US air raid. The story, written by Josh Mayer and Mark Mazzetti, Dateline Washington, a very good place to write about Baghdad, begins, despite the recent arrest of one of his would-be suicide bombers in Jordan and some top aides in Iraq, insurgency mastermind Abu Musab Zarqawi has eluded capture, US authorities say, because his network has a much better intelligence gathering operation than the Americans. But the key is the sourcing. US authorities say, and I followed the sourcing through this story, US authorities say, US officials said one US Justice Department counterterrorism officials said, US authorities say, US officials said, page A10, we continue, it gets better or worse depending on your point of view. Several US officials said, those officials said, the officials confirmed, American officials complained, they said, officials stressed, US authorities believe, said one senior US intelligence official, US officials said, Jordanian officials said, as I changed there, several US officials said, column 8, officials said, officials say US officials said, one US counter-terrorism official said. I think the Los Angeles Times should be called officials say. But this is not, if this is journalism, I've got to get out of my job. Why did we do this? Why didn't we British question Blair much more when he was in touch with God? Maybe some of you can actually tell me why Blair did what he did. You know, my theory is that he managed, and all praise to him, to end Britain's 800-year colonial war in Ireland, a war of blood and treachery and ethnic cleansing and massacre and betrayal. And fair dues to him, as the Irish say. But I think it might have gone to his head, or maybe it was going up to bed in Downing Street past all these oil paintings of, Churchill and Disraeli and Lloyd George, and he began to feel that, Churchill's waistcoat fitted rather well. I hate to say this because I'm praising the Sunday Times, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's not my greatest hero. I left the Times when he gobbled it up and went to a new paper called The Independent. That's why I've got the job I've got now. But the Sunday Times carried a very good piece a few weeks ago in which one of their writers said he was questioning Blair's relationship with God. And he said, didn't God ever give him any advice? Like in February 2003, didn't he say, hey, Tony, this Iraq thing may not be such a good idea? But of course, I rather suspect that Tony Blair's relationship with God is a one-way, it goes directly up, but he doesn't listen to anything in the other direction. It reminds me of that wonderful Siegfried Sassoon poem of the First World War, when the British in their trenches were praying to God for victory, and the Germans in their trenches were praying to God for victory. And as the poem goes, God this, God that, my God, said God, I've got my work cut out. So why did we invade Iraq? I think, yes, it was about oil. If the national product of Iraq was asparagus or carrots, do you really think the 82nd Airborne would be in Mosul? I don't think so, or Fallujah. Why don't we write with power and eloquence? I think that, yes, we journalists should be unbiased and neutral, but we should be unbiased and neutral on the side of those who suffer. I do not believe it is our job, as we're taught in journalism school, apparently, and as I was taught on the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, to write in cliches, to give 50% of each report to each side in a dispute. Dispute, there you go again. That's all right if you're covering a football match or a public inquiry into a new highway that's going to cut through a forest or a green zone. But the Middle East is not a football match. It is a massive human tragedy of blood and terror and betrayal. If we were covering, for example, the slave trade in the 18th century, would we give equal time to the slave ship captain? I don't think so. If we were covering the liberation of a Nazi extermination camp, would we give equal time to the SS spokesman? No. We'd talk to the survivors and write about the victims. When I was in Jerusalem in August 2001, tick, 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 the clock was ticking, I was having lunch in West Jerusalem, the Israeli part of Jerusalem. Well, I claim it as a total unified capital, but it is the part that Israel would have as a capital if the Palestinians had East Jerusalem. And a Palestinian suicide bomber walked into a pizzeria. I call them executioners. They see who they're going to kill. And blew himself up and killed 16 Israelis, more than half of them children. I arrived at the scene. There was a woman with a chair leg through her and a child with no eyes. Do you think I gave equal time to the spokesman for Islamic Jihad who claimed it? No, I did not. And when I was in the Sabra and Shatila camps of Beirut on September 18, 1982, physically climbing over decomposing corpses, 1,700 Palestinian civilians murdered there by Israel's Lebanese Christian Phalangist allies, did I give equal time to the spokesman for the Israeli army who had sent the Phalangists into the camp? No, I did not. I think that there is a moral, ethical duty upon journalists to talk directly to you about the horrors we see and to tell you who the bad guys are and what we saw and tell it how it is. Sometimes my reports from battlefields, I feel like I'm writing a medical report. When I went into the main teaching hospital in Baghdad on the day that the first American tanks crossed the Tigris River, I walked into the emergency room and there was so much blood on the floor it was coming over the top of my shoes. There was a young man, probably a soldier, naked, sitting up, and he was on fire. He was covered in phosphorus. He was burning, crying, "Umma, umma, mummy, mummy, mummy." There was a young man, not a soldier, lying on a trolley on the first floor of the hospital, and his right eye was missing, and someone had stuck a rag in the socket and blood was dribbling down it. One boy, a little boy, came in holding his severed arm and shrieking. When you see these things, how do you communicate it? You're not going to see it on television. They're not going to show you. And I end up writing what, in effect, is a medical report. And the doctors talk to me as they're trying to sew arms on or amputate people's legs. And blood is spraying all over the place. How can you ever support a war after you see that? You know, the Archbishop of Canterbury, poor soul, actually said the 1991 Gulf War was just. Always looking for just wars. And we're always going back to World War II. If you don't believe in a just war, Robert, I get this all the time. Do you believe that the Battle of Britain shouldn't have been fought in 1940? Do you believe that America shouldn't have joined the war after 2 very profitable years of neutrality after Pearl Harbor? The problem is that, you know, when Menachem Begin sent the Israeli army to Beirut in 1982, he wrote this crazed letter to President Reagan, Ronald Reagan, saying, I feel as if I am advancing on Berlin with Hitler in his bunker. You know, Hitler being the preposterous, pathetic, corrupt Arafat. And it was Uri Avnery, a very brave leftist journalist in Israel, who wrote an open letter to Menachem Begin, I think Yediot Aharonot. And he began it, Dear Prime Minister, Hitler is dead. But over and over again, look how Blair, every time someone objected to the coming war in Iraq, we were told we were appeasers, we were like Chamberlain, the people who were going to war were like Winston Churchill or Roosevelt, and of course, Saddam became the Hitler of Baghdad. It's interesting if you go back to the clippings of the Suez War in 1956, Anthony Eden called Nasser the Mussolini of the Nile. I noticed this evening, as I began to watch this extraordinary, quote, debate, unquote, there was John McCain quoting General Eisenhower in World War II. Can we never get rid of World War II? You know, after the Second World War, we, as peoples of the West, initiated an extraordinary system of legal protection of us as human beings and of human rights, whether it be the new protocols of the International Red Cross, which of course were originally founded on the Hague Convention of before the First World War, the creation of the United Nations, the Security Council, the General Assembly. The European Union was originally a coal and trade pact between France and Germany to make sure that Verdun and the Somme of the First World War and the German occupation of Paris in the Second World War never happened again. We set this up. I think we have to start judging just wars after 1945. Was Korea just? Was Vietnam? Was the British in Northern Ireland just? Were the British in fighting Mau Mau in Kenya just? Or AOKA in Cyprus? Or Palestine? Were we right to pull out of India in 1948? We did, and we left behind civil war, and we knew it would happen, as it may well again in Iraq, if we leave, which we will. You know, I think the terrible equation is that America must leave Iraq, and will leave Iraq, and can't leave Iraq. And that is the equation that turns sand into blood. I don't think we only went there, by the way, for oil. I think that superpowers have a visceral need to project military strength. The Romans showed it. Did you know the Romans went to Iraq? Crassus, the Roman general, immensely wealthy because he ran all these slum tenements in Rome. He's the guy who beat Spartacus on the Battle of the River Salaris, 72 BC, or, you know, Kirk Douglas, if we look at it more realistically. Crassus led the Roman legions into Mesopotamia, and they were surrounded by Parthian horsemen, Iraqi insurgents, and they were annihilated. And at the very end, with a few survivors, Crassus was invited into the Parthian tent to negotiate surrender. And as he walked in, they chopped off his head with a sword, filled it full of gold, and sent it back to Rome. All that was missing was the videotape. You know, we don't learn anything from history. Napoleon, when he invaded Egypt in the 18th century, said he was coming to liberate the people of Cairo because the pashas hanged everyone who exercised free speech. In 1917, General Angus Maude of the British Army, the First World War was partly fought, remember, to destroy the Ottoman Empire, which was an ally of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. And we entered Baghdad. General Angus Maude put a huge poster on the wall. I've got an original copy, $2,000. I bought it at an auction in Darlington. It's in Arabic on one side, English on the other. And it stands beside my desk, so I can glance up at it as I'm writing my daily reports in the Middle East. And it begins with the words, it's to the Muhafazat, the governorate of the people of Baghdad. It says, "We came here not as conquerors, but as liberators to free you from generations of tyranny." Angus Maude, not George W. Bush, signed at the bottom, Arabic and English. Incredible. And in 3 years, an insurgency began against British rule. In 1920, the British army besieged a town called Fallujah. Some of our soldiers had their heads cut off when they were captured. We besieged a town called Najaf and demanded the surrender of a Shiite cleric called Badr, not Sadr, but Badr. We got Badr. We didn't get Sadr. In 1920, British intelligence wrote from Baghdad to the War Department in London. This is before we invented ministries of defense, and said that terrorists were crossing the border from Syria, which was under French mandate at the time. And Lloyd George, who was a British Prime Minister in 1920, stood up in the House of Commons in London and said, if British troops leave Iraq now, there will be chaos and civil war. Why don't we journalists carry history books instead of spending all our time Googling and putting clippings here and having an empty notebook? Why don't we carry history books? Why don't our leaders read history? Why do we always accept the narrative laid down for us by our presidents and our prime ministers and our generals and our journalists? When I realized that Tom Friedman is supposed to be the frontier of journalism, I despair. I should add that Tom charges now a minimum of $65,000 an hour for lectures. I charge nothing, but I would pay $65,000 an hour not to listen to Tom Friedman. I cannot understand. I can't understand how we got to this point. I remember I was crossing the Atlantic on 9/11. Of course, the plane turned around when America closed its airspace. But I fly a lot to America, on average every 3.5 weeks, to lecture, give talks, and report, and so on the Middle East, of course. And I know most of the crews on the plane, and I was talking on the satellite phone from the plane to my office on 9/11, after we took off. And before I boarded, I was on my mobile, and they told me there's a light aircraft flown into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. And I mentioned this to the purser on the aircraft, whom I knew. And when we had gone up to the air, I called the office on the aircraft phone, which means I was flying business class, and good for frequent flyer points when you do these trips. But I got onto London, they said there's 2 aircraft, and they're both passenger planes. It's an attack. And then, of course, the Pentagon, and then Pennsylvania. And I went up to the person and said, I don't know who is the pilot on this flight, but I need to talk to him. He needs to know this. And the pilot came back, and all the front of the aircraft crew gathered, and I told them everything I was getting from London. And the pilot said, call London again, I want to know more about this. And we didn't know at that stage, you see, whether the planes were international flights or whether they were domestic. Of course, they were domestic, coming from Logan and so on, but in Boston. But we didn't know if they may have come from Africa or from Europe or wherever. And one of the stewardesses said, where did the planes come from? And we all looked at each other. We were flying, were we not, to America? And the purser and I went round the aircraft together, looking for passengers we didn't like. I found 14. 4 in business class. And of course, they were all Muslims, weren't they? Because they had dark features, or they were using worry beads, or they were reading a Quran, or they had a beard, or they were looking suspiciously at Mr. Bob, because Mr. Bob was looking suspiciously at them. And I realized when I got back to the front of the plane that Osama bin Laden, whom I've met and interviewed 3 times, and I believe was involved from the start, that he had turned nice, liberal, friendly Robert into a racist in about 20 seconds. And I remember sitting back in my seat, and I actually wrote my report. In fact, I didn't write it. I called London and was put over in the old-style journalism to a copy taker in Leeds. A lady said, hello, love, how many words is this, And I just dictated my story out of my head. I said, this is so terrible that it needs to be immediate, fresh, not even written down. And I said, the one question we will not be allowed to ask is why? And I also said, if anyone says that this has changed the world forever, every law and all the forest of laws that we have erected since the Second World War to protect our human rights and our dignity and our privacy and our freedom will be torn down. And sure enough, Bush said it within 24 hours. 9/11 has changed the world forever. And my reaction is no. 19 Arab murderers will not change my world, and nor should it change yours. And I remember the plane, of course, turned around and went back to Europe, and I turned on the television, and sure enough, there was this biblical horror of the Twin Towers coming down, and we've all seen it 1,000 times. And of course, because I'd met bin Laden, the TV companies were coming on. My mobile was, shrieking like a parrot all the time. And I didn't turn it off, I just realized actually, but never mind. CBS, ABC, CNN, all the usual suspects, Irish radio. And one of these interviews, I was abused by a professor at Harvard who should remain nameless. It was Alan Dershowitz, yes, of course it was. And I started saying, look, all you reporters keep asking me, how did this happen, right? Box cutters, tall buildings, aeroplanes. Or who? Right, 19 Arabs who claimed they were Muslims. But why not ask why? And Dershowitz said, to ask the question why is to be pro-terrorist. Mr. Fisk, you are a dangerous man, you are anti-American, and that is the same as being anti-Semitic. I got the message. You ask why, which is a forbidden question, and you're a Nazi. Hence, I started getting postcards from Denver. God knows why Denver. Nobody reads The Independent Denver, telling me that my mother was Eichmann's daughter. My poor mum, who's dead of Parkinson's by then, was actually in the RAF in 1940 repairing radios on Spitfires and trying to fight Hitler, but that doesn't matter. But this was the point, you see. It was very odd because if you have a crime anywhere in the United States, the first thing the cops do is look for a motive. But when we had an international crime against humanity in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, we were forbidden to ask the question why. You were a Nazi if you asked it, because if you asked the question why, you said, be a policeman, right? Your little notebook. These guys were Arabs, that means they come from a place called the Middle East. Is there a problem out there? And then, of course, you have to examine America's relationships with the Arabs, the history of the relationship with the Middle East, and, of course, America's relationship with Israel. And by and large, our journalists did not ask why. They went along with the narrative. Good and evil, they hate us because it's our democracy. The people who, the murderers of 9/11 wouldn't have known democracy if they got up in bed and found it next to them in the morning. This was not what it was about. And now I find I live in the Middle East and wake up each morning in my apartment in Beirut next to the sea, and I hear the palm trees moving and I hear the water of the Mediterranean. And I ask myself, where is the explosion coming today? Sometimes it's a real one, physical, sometimes it's a political explosion. I've never seen the Middle East in such turmoil as it is now, and I see no hope. I often say to people who want to hear about the light at the end of the tunnel, when you realize and fully accept there is absolutely no hope at the moment, then you can begin to construct something that will create hope. But the false idea, we're winning in Iraq, now we're going to win in Afghanistan, for heaven's sakes. I call it in my paper Iraqistan. We went to Afghanistan, we won the war, then we went to Iraq, we won the war, now we're going back to Afghanistan to win the war again. And then, no doubt later we'll have to go back to Iraq, or we'll be going to Pakistan then to sort that out. Endless war. I think one of the reasons why there is such frustration and anger among Muslim people, and I say this frankly because I feel it and I hear it. I live among Muslims, and my driver's a Sunni Muslim, my classical Arabic translator's a Shiite, my landlord's a Druze. My optician is a Christian. I think that part of the reason for the frustrations is that Muslim people, by and large, have not lost their faith. They still believe in God. And we as Westerners largely have lost our faith. Not all, I know. There's still a few around, Midwest, and we've even got a few in England. They go to churches. You can spot them every so often, Sunday mornings. But by and large, I think we've lost our faith. We believe, perhaps because of the Renaissance, perhaps because of the Age of Enlightenment, because we believe in secular values and human rights, we've put these more important than how we came to be here. And I think part of this frustration that exists in the Middle East is because Muslims ask themselves how they who have kept the faith and still believe in God should be dominated politically, socially, culturally, and militarily by people who do not believe in God anymore. I always remember Tariq Aziz standing next to James Baker in 1991, just before the outbreak of the 91 Gulf War, saying, 18 million Iraqis cannot be defeated by a computer. But he was. They were defeated by a computer. By our power, our technology, our will, our guts, if you like, the West has dominated the Muslim world. And how? It was a baker in Baghdad who asked me a question, which of course I hadn't thought of asking in my newspaper. He said, tell me, Mr. Robert, why are you, by you he meant you Western military people, why are you in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan French air base in Dushanbe in Tajik capital, flies close air support to British troops in Helmand province and Kandahar in Afghanistan. Why are you going into Pakistan? Why are you in Afghanistan? Why are you in Iraq? Why are you in Turkey? Why do you have US forces in Jordan and Egypt and Algeria? US special forces have a base near Tamanrasset in the Algerian southern Sahara. Why are you in Oman and Yemen and Qatar and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia? And I had no reply. I hadn't thought about that. You know, it's like there's an iron curtain. In fact, it stretches Greenland, Iceland, US forces in the United Kingdom, Germany, of course, where the Brits still are, Bosnia now, Camp Bondsteel, and Greece, and that joins up with Turkey. From the ice cap almost to the equator, we have a new iron curtain, bigger and more powerful than the one that Winston Churchill spoke of in this country, that stretched from the Baltic to Trieste and the Adriatic. Why is it there? What's behind it? Russia, China, India? Why are we in the Muslim world without armed forces? It doesn't belong to us. You know, I calculated for our Sunday magazine of The Independent a couple of years ago that we now have, per head of population, 22 times as many Western military personnel in the Muslim world than the Crusaders had in the 12th century. And we are surprised at the conflict in which we're all embroiled today. I don't believe in the clash of civilizations. I think that Huntington's book was the material that comes out of the rear end of a bull, or however you have to put it in radio stations in the United States. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, I gave a talk in Manhattan very close to the site of the World Trade Center not that long afterwards, in which I said I was surprised that Muslims had been restrained towards us for so long. In 1992, I made a movie for Channel 4 television in Britain and for the Discovery Channel here in the States called Beirut to Bosnia. It was real film, 35 millimeter. We showed it in cinemas as well, called Beirut to Bosnia. And it was said to be an inquiry, why are Muslims coming to hate us in the West? And at one scene, I walk into a mosque which is on fire in Bosnia. And you can hear my voice on the soundtrack. This is 1992, and I say, when I see things like this, I wonder what the Muslim world has in store for us. The New York Times derided this as being sensationalist. When I was writing my previous book, The Great War for Civilization, I went back to all the rough cuts of this film and discovered that I walked into the mosque on the 11th of September, 1992. I was 9 years out. I don't think we can really be prescient about these things, but I felt something was coming. I actually, when I was researching for the book, went back through all the interviews I'd done on TV in the States and elsewhere. I found that in 1999, I did a broadcast at the beginning of the year on CBC live in Toronto, in which I say, and I don't remember saying it, but I've seen the tape. The interviewer is saying, but surely things are getting better in the Middle East. Israel has peace with Egypt, it has peace with Jordan, Israel's security and peace being the sort of linchpin for the whole Middle East. And I said, no, things are getting worse. There's going to be an explosion soon, I said. And I've run that tape back. What did I mean? I don't even remember saying it, but we were feeling it coming. It was out there. We had this knowledge. And I think that in the past, people were more prescient. They thought more about this. Before 24-hour television, you know, will we get Saddam's capture on the prime time tonight? That's great. We've got a press conference, Mr. President. Mr. Prime Minister Blair, there's a press conference at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. What are we going to say? This is how we run our politics now. You know, this is why we have no plans for Iraq after occupation. You know, Winston Churchill, he's not a hero of mine. My PhD thesis was on Churchill and Ireland, and he didn't look a very nice guy if he was sitting in Dublin in World War II. But Churchill appointed a cabinet committee early in 1941, 4 years before the end of the Second World War, before Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in August of 41, Operation Barbarossa, when the Wehrmacht was still on the coast of France and we were still expecting German invasion. He set up a cabinet committee to organize the government of post-war occupied Nazi Germany. The following year, Cambridge University began degree courses for British diplomats to govern Germany. 4 years before the end of the war. We didn't have a proper plan. Well, the State Department had one, and Rumsfeld had effectively torn it up when we crossed the Tigris River in April of 2003. Why didn't we do this? What did we do wrong? Why don't we plan for the future? You know, I was talking to a CIA officer in Kufa in a Spanish camp before the Spanish left after the Madrid bombings. He came up to me one evening, and a huge pistol, and he said, So tell me, Bob, what did we do wrong? He said, well, I said, when you got to Baghdad, you could have set up a huge tent hospital city and said, come, all your masses and your poor, we will heal you and look after your wounds and protect you. We didn't do that. We didn't care about Iraqis. We still don't care about Iraqis. How many Iraqis have been killed in the war? We haven't the slightest idea. Anyone here who can name an Iraqi, and there may be one or two, who's been killed since 2003, name him, put up your hand. Okay, there's one. I can put up a hand too. That's it too. We don't care. But you can look in your paper this morning. You know, what is the figure now? 4,176, is it? The number of American dead. We know their ages, what unit they come from, their names, whether they're married, how many children they've got. We care about us, but we don't care about them. I said to the CIA guy, you know, you might take a leaf out of the Romans, forgetting crucifixion for the moment. Every time the Romans occupied a country, they made all the people citizens of Rome. I said, if we loved the Iraqis, why don't we make them citizens of America and Britain? And they wouldn't all pile on the next plane to JFK. They'd be proud to feel that we loved them and we wanted them and that we'd come for them. Always we go to the Middle East with our horses and our M1A1 Abrams tanks and our swords and our Apache helicopters and our Humvees, and we want to give the Muslims more democracy or some democracy. Their dictators mostly having been appointed by us, and in many cases, of course, people like Saddam. And we offer them some packages of human rights from our supermarket shelves. And I think they'd like some of that. But I think they want a different kind of freedom. I think they want freedom from us. And this we do not intend to give them. I'm talking about prescience and things like this, but I'll quote you a little bit of Winston Churchill. Here is Winston Churchill talking in 1937. On the 23rd of July, he wrote an essay in 1937. Remember, this is 11 years before the Nakba, the Palestinian disaster, 11 years before Israel's War of Independence. And he was talking about how the wealthy, crowded, progressive Jewish state will lie in the plains and on the seacoast of Palestine, around it in the hills and the uplands, stretching far and wide into the illimitable deserts. The warlike Arabs of Syria, Transjordania, and Arabia, backed by the armed forces of Iraq, offer the ceaseless menace of war. To maintain itself, the Jewish state must be armed to the teeth and must bring in every able-bodied man to strengthen its army. But how long would this process be allowed to continue by the great Arab populations in Iraq and Palestine? Can it be expected that the Arabs will stand by impassively and watch the building up with Jewish capital and resources of a Jewish army equipped with the most deadly weapons of war until it was strong enough not to be afraid of them? This is 1937. And if ever the Jewish army reached that point, who can be sure that cramped within their narrow limits, they would not plunge out into the new undeveloped lands that lie around them? This was 30 years before the 1967 war. This guy looked ahead. We don't, not even in our journalism. Here's Churchill, who's gone on holiday to Morocco in 1936. Churchill, these were the wilderness years when he was out of power and everyone mocked him because he didn't believe in appeasement. He was constantly telling the British government, you need to rearm, Hitler is going to attack. But he was in Morocco on holiday, and he was talking about how, it was under French rule then, of course, as was Tunisia and tragically Algeria as well. And he was talking about how, there were modern hospitals, new roads, telephones. And he's writing, actually, an article in the Daily Express that's a little bit flowery. The Arab inhabitants are a perpetual attraction with their flowing, many-coloured robes. Every peasant is a picture, every crowd a pageant. He's in journalistic mode, you see. If winter sunshine is the quest, here is its achievement. But then he goes on, thus far all smiles. Is there a darker underside? The Arabs are a proud and ancient race, till only yesterday a race of conquerors. Are they tamed? Are they reconciled to this new civilization with its order, its efficiency, its many benefits, its proofs of active progress, and its sense of effort? Or are they dreaming of the days of Arab greatness? The faith of Islam holds them all in a discipline of its own. From the balcony of my up-to-date hotel, I heard all night long the chants and drumbeats of the mosques, an endless repetition of choruses in which war and religion have an equal part. Who shall plumb the future? Ouch, as I always write when I find clippings like this. This guy was talking about Islamicism before we even dreamt of it. When I go back and think, when I went to the Middle East 32 years ago, more than half my life ago, all our enemies, I put our in quotes, and will include Israel as an honorary member of the West. All our enemies were secular, socialist, leftist, pro-Soviet. You know, the People's Popular Republic of, which was never belonging to the people, it was never popular, they weren't republics, but the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, Democratic Front for the Liberation, all these people were nationalist, leftist, secular. But today, all, quote, our enemies, unquote, are Islamist. Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the Taliban. Why did this happen? Do we not realize this change has occurred? And we are in their countries. We are on their land. I believe that our military must leave the entire Muslim world. We must have the strongest relations politically, culturally, socially, religious. Flood it with our tourists. They'd love to see us. They're not anti-us. But we must get out because these places do not belong to us. I was giving a talk in Dublin, Ireland a few weeks ago, and a colleague of mine who was a sort of anchorman beside me in our lecture, Vincent Brown, who was a colleague of mine in Northern Ireland, but he's actually a Southern Catholic. He said, but surely, Robert, isn't Islam a threat to us? And I said, oh, really, Vincent? You mean the Egyptian army is in Dublin? You mean the Syrians are in London or the Jordanian army is in Washington? You know, we just don't realize where we are and what we're doing. Nor do we tell you. Because of our cliches, because of our fear of offending either side, particularly the Israelis in the Middle East, because we're frightened of being called anti-Semitic, which is a grotesque slander against any decent person who dares to criticize Israel. I think that people who use the word anti-Semitism in this way will make anti-Semitism respectable, and shame upon them for doing it. You know, there are real anti-Semites out there, and we should all be against them, not falsely using this word against decent people. But we don't tell you the truth. We don't get it across. And we don't even write well. I'm going to read you a couple of extracts from a letter sent home by a US Marine in Fallujah. I have permission to read this to you. Written to his dad. Shortly after he wrote this, he was quite badly wounded by an IED, improvised explosive device, a bomb beside the road, but he recovered and he's okay. And he's talking here about trying to get Iraqis to run the local government in Ramadi, next to Fallujah. We are trying to, he writes with an eloquence I can't compete with. I don't agree with all he says, but listen to the way he writes. We're trying to empower the Iraqis to walk alongside the Marines, but the graft has not yet taken. There is something culturally childish in their understanding of basic Western governance and management that will require immeasurable education and probably several generations to overcome if they find it of any interest. That education is, of course, a choice that they have to make on their own. They are not our people. Our understanding of their tribal governance and its relationship to formal civic management is equally naive and charges our frustration. The problem now is that their every inconvenience has become our responsibility. You're an occupation, right? They act as if they cannot comprehend our sacrifices and are thus ungrateful for them. The reality is that they cannot culturally comprehend our altruism or believe our stated intentions. Even though it is not in their desire to offend, we are insulted and it bleeds us of affection and tolerance. Liberation will compete with invasion as our legacy, but locally we are ideologically irrelevant. Liberation will compete with invasion as our legacy. It is a region of people making alliances, business deals, friendships and enemies one day at a time without a real concept of sustainable services, resources or trust. No future, just daily survival as they know it. Family and tribe. Our contributions may be counted long after we have withdrawn, but they will not recount the names of our fallen, so many now. Each wound will be absorbed into the quiet sadness that we allow to pass beneath us as a people and a country. Our loss will never even have occurred to most people here. And if you think he doesn't have a sense of humor, here he is discussing actual local government and elections in Ramadi. He's writing to his dad, remember. So what news about the new government, you may ask? Well, the provisional military governor was replaced by the transitional governor, who resigned under threat and was replaced with another transitional governor. He was then replaced by the emergency appointed governor, who was just replaced by the selected governor chosen by the elected provincial council. He never made a speech or publicized his views, never debated the other candidates, and was not present during the selection, never making an acceptance speech. He was promptly kidnapped by a rival tribe, while his tribe fought another tribe on the Syrian border. The recently displaced emergency-appointed governor returned in hopes of regaining his position. However, the deputy governor is now serving as the acting governor, while the actual selected governor is in captivity. But there was an election, so democracy is in full bloom, I am to understand. You've got to feel sorry for this guy, apart from the fact that he writes like Joseph Conrad. We are now trying to force the power of decision onto the elected provincial council and the city. It is difficult. It is a difficult thing to keep myself inactive in matters of governance here. The instinct to impose order and command the requisite discipline in the Iraqi leadership must be quelled in order to allow sovereign stewardship to develop at its native pace and in a native form. I fight myself to remain insignificant in the process. I haven't the nature for passive observation. I share the American fascination with action, and it has consistently betrayed us in our foreign policy. Our continued involvement will continue the state of dependency, and our eventual departure will leave nothing but cosmetic structure here. Iraq will return to what it is. Our common sense is not common to this people, and that understanding must be given proper respect. I do my best, but I twitch with an urge for the folly of intrusion. You won't read that in your Seattle newspaper or your San Francisco Chronicle or your LA Times or your New York Times. How come you won't? How come this is an ordinary soldier who can write with such eloquence and get the truth out, and we don't tell you about it? There's a major problem here. How are we going to get out of Iraq? I don't mean how we're going to tell the world. We'll concoct some treaty that will allow us to run away in some form. But how are you going to be told? And how is the military or the administration, whoever forms it after tonight's debate, or the British for that matter, how are we as civilians going to be? How's it going to explain to us of why we've got to get out of Iraq after mission accomplished and all this tremendous success? You know, I've been an astute reader of the American press for a long time. I found that about 2 years ago, the letters columns of little local papers, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. How many people here have been to Cedar Rapids, by the way? Yes, I'm sorry about it anyway. I thought it was full of mountains and waterfalls. You know, it's mile after mile of wet beet fields and railroad yards. But anyway, in these little towns and in Denver and places like that, I found the letters columns were coming up with letters from readers like, why are we still in Iraq trying to teach these people who don't want the benefits of our civilization and dying for them? Right? And 2 articles I picked up. One was the New York Times, David Brooks. And at the same time, the same day as USA Today, this is not an advertisement for the New York Times, whose coverage of the Middle East, in my view, is incomprehensible, and USA Today, which I even more suggest you don't read. David Brooks has been reading about the British occupation of Iraq in 1920. At last, I mean, he didn't read it before the invasion, but he's getting around to it now. The British tried to encourage responsible Iraqi self-government to no avail. That's true enough. Today, Iraq is in much worse shape, complete social disintegration. But it is exacerbated by the same old Iraqi demons, greed, bloodlust, and a mind-boggling unwillingness to compromise for the common good, even in the face of self-immolation. Can you believe this rubbish? Iraq is teetering on the edge of futility, whatever that means. It will soon be time to effectively end Iraq. It will be time to radically diffuse authority to the only communities that are viable, the clan tribal sect. And here is Ralph Peters in USA Today. He's a former US serviceman. He also believed the invasion was a good thing at the time. I was convinced that the Middle East was so politically, socially, morally, and intellectually stagnant that we had to risk intervention or face generations of terrorism and tumult. We got that afterwards, of course, in many cases. But, well, that's pretty much, you know, that's what people said about the Ottoman Empire. And then he says, the country's prime minister has thrown in his lot with al-Sadr. The police are less accountable than they were under Saddam. Our extensive investment in Iraqi law enforcement produced only death squads. And then he says, only a military coup, which might come in the next few years, could hold this artificial country together. But we had a military coup. We supported Saddam. We had a military dictator. Then we executed him. Now we want another one. We did give Iraqis a unique chance to build a rule of law democracy. They preferred to indulge in old hatreds, confessional violence, ethnic bigotry, and a culture of corruption. These 2 articles appeared on the same day. Isn't it remarkable? And people get the government they deserve. It's their tragedy, not ours. Iraq was the Arab world's last chance to board the train to modernity. They could watch CNN. to give the region a future, not just a bitter past. And then he says, the violence staining Baghdad streets with gore is a symbol of the comprehensive inability of the Arab world to progress in any sphere of organized human endeavor. I'm quoting, this is a real thing, this is a real clipping, this isn't the internet. We are witnessing the collapse of a civilization. If they continue to revel in fratricidal slaughter, we must leave. And then, just in case you're feeling bad about this, we'll still be the greatest power on earth, indispensable to other regions and states, such as the Persian Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, watch out Saudi Arabia, that are terrified of Iran's growing might, you see. If the Arab world and Iran embark on an orgy of bloodshed, the harsh truth is that we may be the beneficiaries. So that's okay then. You see, this is the sort of pap that we are going to use as grit on the sand to allow our tank tracks to gain purchase and leave. They don't deserve us. We tried. We carried out the white man's burden, and they didn't want us, and more fool them, but we're still okay. That is going to be the story you get, and I get, less in Britain, but still there, because we've basically run away already, to get us out. And I go back to the same old terrible equation. We must leave, we will leave, and we can't leave. This is one way out. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have much good or happy to say to you about journalism or about the future. If the surge has worked, it's only because the two major communities in Iraq had already purged each other from each other's homes. It was over. Now we're in Afghanistan. Half of Afghanistan is back in the hands of the Taliban. You know, I was given by a very dear friend, this is the last thing I'm going to say before I finish here, the official British inquiry into the loss of British troops at May 1, which was a big battle at the end of the Victorian Age when we were trying to govern Afghanistan, protect the British Empire, of course. And what happened is that at one point the British Grenadiers were firing in long lines. If you've seen the movie, I can't remember what it's called now, the movie about the Battle of Rorke's Drift with Michael Caine, you see the Zulu, it's called. You see the British troops firing, and then the next line gets up and fires. And in the annex to this official British report, big thick one with red leather covers and the gold still visible on the spine, there's a Captain Mannering who records how at the Battle of May 1 there were some Afghans wearing black turbans who would choose a particular British soldier in the line. And even if they were cut down, some of them would get through and seize this one man, pull him out, and cut his throat in front of the other British troops. And I read with astonishment when Captain Mannering, in this report of 1882, I think, said they were called the Taliban. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. If you